Nobody tells you this before you awaken. Nobody tells you that there are things you're going to lose, things you'll never get back, things that, once lost, are gone forever. Eckhart Tolle speaks of awakening as a profound transformation. A transformation means that something must die, so that something new can be born, and what dies doesn't return. It cannot return. That's why some people are afraid to awaken, because intuitively they know there's no turning back. Today I'm going to share what awakened people permanently lose, what they can never recover, and why, despite everything, this loss is the greatest blessing imaginable. The first thing you lose is the ability to live in ignorance. It seems simple, but it's devastating. Before awakening, you could ignore certain truths. You could pretend you didn't see. You could distract yourself. You could go back to sleep. After you awaken, that's over. You see. And once you see, you can't unsee. It's like trying to forget that the sun rises in the east. You can close your eyes, but you know. And that knowing changes everything. Tolle describes this as awareness emerging, and it can no longer be suppressed. You can try. Some people try desperately. They try to go back to sleep. They try to distract themselves with the same things that worked before, but it doesn't work anymore. Awareness is there, watching everything. The second loss is innocence. Not the pure innocence that is wisdom, but the innocence that's ignorance in disguise. The innocence of believing in the illusions of the world, of accepting narratives without question, of blindly trusting the structures that society has created. When you awaken, you see through these illusions. You see that much of what was taught as truth was just conditioning. You see that the rules of the social game are arbitrary. You see that people are asleep and don't even know it, and you can't go back to believing. You can't participate in the game with the same naivete. You know too much, and that knowledge is irreversible. The third loss is your former self, the ego you've built over decades, the persona you presented to the world, the story you told about who you are. Tolle teaches that the ego is a mental construct, an accumulation of thoughts, memories, beliefs, and emotions with which we identify. And when awakening happens, this identification begins to dissolve. You look at who you were, and you don't recognize them anymore. Those worries that seemed so important now seem ridiculous. Those goals you pursued now seem empty. That person you pretended to be now seems like a stranger. And that person doesn't return. You can try to resuscitate them. You can try to put on the old masks, but they don't fit anymore. You've grown too big for them. The fourth loss is the ability to identify completely with your thoughts. Before awakening, you and your thoughts were the same thing. You believed in every thought that arose. You were dominated by the constant mental noise. After awakening, a space opens up. You realize there's something observing the thoughts, something that isn't the thoughts, and that realization changes your relationship with your mind forever. You still have thoughts, lots of thoughts, but you no longer believe in all of them blindly. You see that they're just thoughts, clouds passing in the sky of awareness, and that distance can never be closed. The fifth loss is the illusion of control. Before awakening, you believed you were in command, that your decisions were that you chose your path, that you could control the results. After awakening, you see the truth. You see that much of what you thought was choice was actually conditioning. You see that the ego, which thought it was deciding, was itself an illusion. You see that life flows independently of your attempts to control it. This may seem scary, losing the illusion of control, but it's also profoundly liberating. Because along with the illusion of control, you lose the burden of having to control everything. You can finally relax and let life flow. The sixth loss is the ability to worry in the same way. Before awakening, worry was almost automatic. Your mind created disaster scenarios constantly. You lived in the future imagining problems that would probably never happen. After awakening, worry loses its power. Not that you become irresponsible, but you see worry for what it really is. repetitive thoughts about a future that doesn't exist, and that vision weakens the mechanism. You can still plan, you can still prepare, but the chronic anxiety about the future dissolves, and it doesn't return with the same intensity, because you've seen through it. The seventh loss is the need to be right. Before awakening, the ego was always defending its positions, always arguing, always trying to prove that it was right and others were wrong. After awakening, that need decreases dramatically. You realize that being right is an ego concern. That truth doesn't need to be defended. That being right is less important than being present, and this completely changes your relationships. You can listen without needing to rebut. You can disagree without needing to convince. You can be at peace even when others think differently. The eighth loss is the ability to hate genuinely. This may seem strange, but it's a real loss. Before awakening, you could hate. You could cultivate resentment. You could fuel anger for years. After awakening, you see that hate is poison that you take, hoping the other person dies. You see that the person you hate is suffering as much as you are. You see that behind every behavior you condemn, there's pain and unconsciousness. And when you see that, hate loses its power. You can still disagree. You can still distance yourself from toxic people, but the poison of hate no longer sustains itself, and that's a poison that isn't missed. The ninth loss is the illusion of separation. Before awakening, you saw yourself as a separate entity, separate from others, separate from nature, separate from the universe. You were in here, and everything else was out there. After awakening, that boundary begins to dissolve. You realize that separation was an illusion created by the ego, that you aren't separate from life, that you are life, manifesting in a particular form. And that realization changes everything. It changes how you treat others. It changes how you treat nature. It changes how you see yourself. The illusion of separation is the root of so much suffering, and when it falls, a lot of suffering falls with it. The 10th loss is perhaps the most profound. You lose the fear of death in the same way you had it before. Before awakening, death was the absolute end, the end of everything you were. Complete extinction. After awakening, you realize that what dies is the ego, the mental construct and the story, but what you truly are, the awareness that observes everything, that was never born and therefore cannot die. Eckhart Tolle speaks of recognizing the eternal being behind the human form. When you have that recognition, even if just for a moment, your relationship with death changes forever. The fear might still surface, but it no longer holds the same power. Now you might be thinking that this all sounds pretty good. Where's the real loss? The real loss is that you can no longer participate in the world in the same way. You can no longer pretend to care about things that don't matter. You can no longer play games that you see as empty. You can no longer belong to groups whose illusions you see through. This can be lonely, very lonely, because most people are still asleep. And when you're awake in a world of sleeping people, you feel like a foreigner, like someone who doesn't belong. And you can't go back. You can't pretend to be asleep just to fit in. Awareness won't allow it. It sees through any pretense, including your own. Tolle acknowledges this loneliness. He talks about waking up in a world that hasn't yet awakened, about the difficulty of communicating with someone operating on a different level of awareness, about the patience necessary to live with the unconsciousness of others. But he also points to the other side, because along with the loneliness comes a deeper connection, not with persona, but with beings, not with masks, but with essences. The connections you make after awakening are rarer, but infinitely more real. And there's another aspect of loss that we need to address. You lose the ability to distract yourself in the same way. Before awakening, you could lose yourself in entertainment. You could spend hours consuming content without thinking. You could anesthetize yourself with distraction. After awakening, this becomes more difficult. Awareness is always there, observing. Even when you try to distract yourself, there's a part of you that sees what you're doing, that questions whether this is really what you want, This can be frustrating at first. You lose the ability to completely shut down, but over time, you realize that you no longer want to shut down. That constant presence is more satisfying than any distraction. You also lose the ability to blame others in the same way. Before awakening, it was easy. Everything that went wrong was someone else's fault. Your parents and the government, your partner, your boss, the universe. After awakening, you see your own participation in everything. You see how your choices, conscious and unconscious, created your reality. You see that blaming others is a way to avoid responsibility. And that's liberating and heavy at the same time. Liberating because you take back your power. Heavy because you can no longer hide behind excuses. Perhaps the most painful loss is that of relationships that don't survive awakening. Because when you change, and not everyone around you can keep up. Some people could only relate to your ego, to your masks, to the version of you that played the same games they did. When that version disappears, the foundation of the relationship disappears along with it, and there's no way to force a reconnection. You can't go back to being who you were just to maintain a relationship. Awareness won't allow it. Tolle talks about how awakening inevitably transforms relationships. Some deepen in unimaginable ways, others simply end, and trying to artificially maintain what needs to end only prolongs the suffering. Let me explore a few more losses that are rarely mentioned, because awakening affects areas of life you can't even imagine. You lose the ability to consume the same media. Movies that once entertained you now seem shallow. News that once captivated you now seems like manipulation. Conversations that once interested you now seem repetitive. It's not that you've become arrogant or superior. It's that you see behind the curtain. You see the formulas. You see the patterns. You see the attempts at emotional manipulation. And once you see it, you can no longer be manipulated in the same way. This can be isolating, because culture is built around shared entertainment, around conversations about the latest movie or show, around collective outrage about the news. And when you can no longer genuinely participate in these conversations, you feel excluded. You also lose the ability to live on autopilot. Before awakening, you could spend entire days without really being present. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, all on autopilot. The mind took care of everything while you were somewhere else. After awakening, the autopilot fails. Awareness keeps bringing you back to the present moment, keeps asking you, are you really here? Is this really what you want to be doing? In the beginning, this can be exhausting. It's much easier to live on autopilot. It requires no attention. It requires no choice. But over time, you realize that living on autopilot wasn't really living. It was just existing. Another significant loss is the ability to conform without questioning. Before awakening, you followed the rules. You did what was expected. You didn't question the structures, but it was easier that way. After awakening, questioning becomes automatic. Why do we do it this way? Who decided it should be this way? Does this really make sense? The questions arise naturally, and this can put you in conflict with systems that depend on conformity, with jobs that demand blind obedience, with institutions that punish questioning. You become a disruptive element simply by seeing what others prefer to ignore. You also lose the ability to be satisfied with external achievements in the same way. Before awakening, each promotion, each purchase, each recognition brought satisfaction. Temporary but real. After awakening, you see through these achievements. You see that the satisfaction they bring is fleeting. You see that the next goal will bring the same dissatisfaction as the previous one. You see that the happiness you were looking for out there was never there. This may seem depressing, and in some ways it is, because you lose the hope that something external will complete you. But this loss of false hope opens space for something much deeper, the peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. There is also the loss of automatic reactivity. Before awakening, someone offended you, and you reacted immediately. The anger arose without filter. The defense was automatic. After awakening, a space opens up between stimulus and response. Someone says something offensive, And before reacting, there is a moment of choice, of observation, of questioning. Do I really need to react to this? This space changes everything. Nobody tells you that. As you awaken, you stop being a robot, reacting programmatically. You become an aware being who chooses how to respond, and that choice never fully disappears. You lose the ability to lie to yourself with the same effectiveness. Before awakening, self-deception was an efficient tool. You could convince yourself of almost anything. You could rationalize any behavior. You could ignore any uncomfortable truth. After awakening, your awareness sees through those self-deceptions. It points out when you're lying to yourself. It doesn't leave you alone until you face the truth. This can be uncomfortable, very uncomfortable, because there are truths about ourselves that we'd rather not see. But this relentless clarity is also what allows for real transformation. Another loss worth mentioning is the ability to live exclusively for yourself. Before awakening, you could focus only on your own interests, your own goals, your own satisfaction. After awakening, you feel the connection to everything. You feel that the suffering of others affects you. You feel that you can't be truly happy. While others suffer, the separation falls away, and with it, pure selfishness falls away too. This doesn't mean you become a martyr, but it does mean that your circle of concern expands naturally. You can no longer ignore the suffering around you as if it weren't your problem. You also lose the ability to postpone indefinitely. Before awakening, you could always say, "One day, I'll really live. One day, I'll do what I really want. Only one day, I'll be who I really am." After awakening, you see that one day is an illusion that only now exists, that if you don't live for real today, you may never live. The urgency of presence no longer allows for infinite postponements, and this can be scary, because suddenly, you have no more excuses. You can no longer hide behind one day fee. You need to confront now what you were putting off. But here's what nobody tells you. Each of these losses is actually a blessing in disguise. You lose ignorance and gain the truth. You lose the false identity and gain your true self. You lose the illusory control and gain the peace of surrender. You lose the fear of death and gain the awareness of the eternal. What you lose was never really yours. They were illusions, constructions, dreams. What you gain is who you always were, underneath it all. And that can't be lost, because it isn't something you acquired. It's your essential nature. Tolle uses the analogy of gold covered in mud. Awakening doesn't add anything to you. It removes the mud. And what was hidden underneath was always gold, always precious, always indestructible. I want to talk about something that Tolle addresses deeply, the relationship between loss and growth. He says that many people only awaken through suffering, through loss, through crisis. Why? Because loss breaks the structures of the ego. When you lose something you considered essential to your identity, the ego is weakened, and in that weakening, awareness can emerge. Loss of health, loss of a relationship, loss of a job, loss of money, loss of a loved one. Any of these can be the catalyst that initiates the awakening. Tolle himself went through a deep crisis before his awakening, years of depression and anxiety. That culminated in a night of total despair. And it was on that night that something in him died and something new was born. He doesn't recommend that you seek suffering, but he points out that if you are suffering, if you are losing, this may be exactly what your awareness needs more to awaken. Loss creates space. It removes what was taking up room, and in that empty space, something new can arise, something that was always there, but had no way to manifest And that's why people who have gone through great losses often have a depth that others don't have. They were forced to confront truths that others can continue avoiding. There's an interesting paradox here. The most awakened people are often the ones who have lost the most, not because loss is good in itself, but because loss breaks the illusions, and without illusion, the truth can finally be seen. I also want to talk about the process of loss in awakening, because it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, it's irregular, and it's confusing. You might lose an illusion and feel liberated, then grab another illusion, even more tightly. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. That's the normal rhythm of awakening. Tolle talks about how the ego can infiltrate even the spiritual process. It can create a spiritual ego. It can cling to the identity of an awakened person. It can transform even the search for truth into just another illusion. And when this happens, more loss is needed. The loss of the spiritual identity, the loss of the pride of having awakened, the loss of feeling special, for seeing what others don't see. True awakening leaves nothing for the ego to cling to, not even the idea of awakening itself. And that's why it's so radical, and that's why the ego resists so much. Let me talk about how to deal with these losses, because knowing what you're going to lose, Mark, is one thing. Knowing how to get through it is another. The first thing is to not resist, and resistance to loss multiplies the suffering. When you fight to keep what's going away, you prolong the agony. When you accept that something needs to go, the transition becomes smoother. Tolle teaches that what you resist persists. The more you fight against the loss, the stronger it becomes. The more you accept it, the faster it completes. The second thing is to allow the mourning. You are losing parts of yourself. Even if they are illusions, they were familiar, they were comfortable, and it's normal to feel sadness when they go away. Don't rush the process. Don't pretend that everything is okay when it isn't. Allow yourself to feel the loss completely, because it's through complete feeling that you can finally let go. The third thing is to trust the process. Awakening has its own intelligence. It knows what needs to go and when. You don't need to control it. In fact, trying to control it only gets in the way. Your only responsibility is to be present. Observe what happens. Allow what needs to be allowed. The rest happens by itself. The fourth thing is to find support. People who have already been through this. Communities of sincere seekers. Teachers who can guide you. You don't need to do this alone. And trying to do it alone can be unnecessarily difficult. Tolle talks about the importance of being in the presence of awakened people. That presence transmits something that words can't. It shows that it's possible, that there is life on the other side of the loss. The fifth thing is to remember that the losses are temporary, but the gains are permanent. The pain of loss passes. The freedom that comes from it remains. The mourning diminishes, and peace settles in. The peace that emerges remains. You're trading the temporary for the permanent, the illusion for the real, suffering for peace. This is more than a fair trade, even if it doesn't seem like it at the moment. And here is the ultimate truth about these losses. They aren't really losses at all, they're liberations. You don't lose anything of value. You liberate yourself from prisons you thought were homes, from chains you thought were arms, from illusions you thought were truths. Awakening doesn't take anything from you, it returns you to yourself. And that self is more than anything you could lose. It's infinite. It's eternal. It's indestructible. If you're in the process of awakening, you might be feeling these losses intensely. You might be grieving for what you're leaving behind. You might be frightened by what lies ahead. That's normal. That's part of the process. Even Eckhart Tolle went through a period of disintegration before finding the peace he teaches today. The death of the ego isn't painless, but what's born on the other side is worth infinitely more than what dies. Remember this: you are not losing who you are. You're losing who you never were. And that's the difference that changes everything. If you felt the truth of these words, the super thanks below is your way to support this work. It's you saying that truth matters, even when it hurts. That awakening is worth the price. That you are willing to lose what was never yours to gain what always was. Each contribution allows us to continue revealing truths that transform lives. The question I leave you with is this: what are you willing to lose to find yourself? What are you holding on to that you need to release? What in you needs to die so that you can finally live? Tell us in the comments. I want to know your experience. What have you already lost in the process of awakening? And what have you gained in return? And if this video touched something in you, share it with someone who's in the middle of that journey, someone who is feeling the losses and doesn't yet see the gains. Your sharing might be exactly what that person needs to continue.